This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry.
Welcome to episode 22 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry, and for today's episode, we will be talking about players you should not be afraid to start in Week 5. Every week with this episode, we'd like to target players who are outside the top 20 at running back and top 20 at wide receiver and outside the top 10 at tight end. Before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show on Twitter. We are at FFAlchemistPod. Again, it is at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. For the running back position, there are 3 players this week that are outside the top 20 of ESPN's weekly rankings that I think you should be starting here in Week 5. So first, let's talk about Jets running back Breece Hall, currently running back 22 on the weekly rankings. Now, it was reported this week that Breece Hall is no longer on any sort of pitch count and he can receive a full workload if the Jets desire to do that. Well, that announcement is just in time for the Denver Broncos, who have given up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs this season. The Broncos have allowed 20 offensive touchdowns. That's 6 more than any other team. Now enter Breece Hall. Limiting rushing attempts to 20 attempts on the season, across the entire league, Breece Hall ranks second in yards per carry at 6.6 yards per carry. So far this year, Breece Hall and Dalvin Cook have been close to 50-50 in snaps, rushing attempts, and targets, but Hall has been significantly better on all performance metrics. Yards per carry, Hall 6.6 to Cook 2.5. Yards after contact, Hall 5.7 to Cook 1.9. Yards per reception, Hall 8.4 to 5.5 for Cook. Hall is about to become the lead back, and Dalvin Cook is going to be relegated to nothing more than a handcuff. The second running back option is going to be Texans running back Dameon Pierce, currently running back 25 on the week. Now, he has a matchup with the Atlanta Falcons, who have been pretty good against opposing running backs, but it's also a bit fluky as the Falcons, they drew the Packers without Aaron Jones, they drew the Lions without David Montgomery. However, I'm more interested in what Dameon Pierce has done over the last few weeks. If you look at his opportunity share by game, and again, opportunity share would be rush plus target attempts, his share has gone from 21% to 26% to 31% to 40% last week, and he was propelled by his largest carry count of the season. He had 24 carries in Week 4. His previous counts were 11, 15, and 14. So Dameon Pierce certainly trending up in a very competitive matchup. And then the last recommendation, this is admittedly going to be a riskier play, but Khalil Herbert at running back 27 I think can be a flex consideration. Now, I noted on the previous episode how the Bears, they finally had a game with a neutral or positive game script throughout the entire game, and Khalil Herbert got a workhorse role in Week 4 because of it. He had 79% snap participation. He had 58% of the team's rushing attempts, 63% route participation. He had 5 targets, which was almost a 20% target per route run rate. He finished with over 22 fantasy points. He had a running back 1 workload that we were looking for from a fantasy standpoint. Now, the spread on the Thursday night game against Washington, the Commanders are favored by 6 at home. But if Chicago can keep it competitive, then I expect Herbert to have another strong workload. By the way, the Commanders have given up over 20 fantasy points to opposing running backs in 3 straight games. Now let's switch here and take a look at receiving options. I got 3 wide receivers and 1 tight end recommendation for Week 5. So speaking of the Thursday night contest, let's talk about Commanders wide receiver Terry McLaurin, currently wide receiver 22 on the week. Now, McLaurin has had 3 straight double-digit fantasy point games, and he's coming off his best game of the year in Week 4, where he had 10 targets, which led to a 22 fantasy point game. Now, McLaurin's target share has risen every week as well. He has gone from 14% to 18% to 21% to 26%, as he has been nursing a toe injury to start the year, but he is trending towards the wide receiver 1 that he has been in previous years. On top of that, the Bears rank as a bottom 5 unit against the pass and have given up over 30 points to opposing wide receivers in 3 straight games. The next wide receiver recommendation is going to be Jags wide receiver Christian Kirk, currently at wide receiver 27. Now, since week 2, Christian Kirk has led the team in targets, receptions, routes run, targets per route run rate, and is second in the team in air yards. And from a fantasy standpoint, he has greatly outperformed teammate Calvin Ridley over the last 3 weeks. Now, ironically, Calvin Ridley is also ranked wide receiver 25. He's ranked 2 spots higher than Kirk in the weekly rankings. But over the last 3 weeks, it's Kirk who is averaging almost 10 more points a game than Calvin Ridley. And then an option outside the top 30 at wide receiver that I think you could get away with as a flex this week is going to be Packers wide receiver Romeo Doubs, who is currently wide receiver 34 on the week 5 rankings. Now, Doubs has back-to-back weeks with high target volume. He had 12 targets in week 3. He had 13 targets in week 4. He has 3 of his 4 fantasy games this year. He's gone over 18 points. He's currently a top 20 wide receiver through 4 weeks. On top of that, he leads all Packers skill players in snaps, routes, and targets. He has 3 touchdowns through 4 weeks. And look, it remains to be seen what Christian Watson's full-time impact will be, but Doubs is certainly yielding solid wide receiver 2 production. His matchup, the Raiders, have given up over 30 fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in every game this year. And for the tight end position, let's just agree up front that finding quality production at the tight end position, once you get outside the top 5, 6, 7 players, is really difficult week in and week out. But I would recommend Tyler Higbee of the Los Angeles Rams. He's currently tied in 18 on the week 5 rankings. Now, Higbee has had back-to-back double-digit fantasy performances, and he's coming off a game in which he had 11 targets. And the potential is there for a high-scoring game with the Eagles this week. Plus, the Eagles, they rank 30th in points allowed to opposing tight ends this year. Now, if Cooper Kupp remains out in week 5, I think Higbee is a very reasonable start this week. So that'll wrap up episode 22 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back next week with a recap of week 5 and look ahead to waiver wire targets for week 6. This is Dustin Chandry signing off for the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.